Good afternoon, everyone. Whoa. Before we start, I'd like to join the other presenters in thanking the organizers, especially Sharon, for inviting me to join this fascinating conference. And thank you, Aya, for getting me here. The term fan fiction, this is really loud. The term fan fiction refers to creative products by fans of a given fictional work, novels, TV, film, you name it, which are ostensibly set in the same world, often starring the same characters. To call back Ronen's talk earlier in the day, it's a form of quotation, of explicit referentiality, with a twist or two. Now, fan fiction actually predates what we call the digital age, right? The age of the internet, by a considerable margin. The first wave is typically associated with the 1960s and early 1970s with fan-made magazines featuring stories based on properties like Star Trek. With the advent of the internet as both a tool of communication and a publishing space, this field has expanded considerably. Now, Henry Jenkins, who is one of the foremost experts in pre-internet fandom, describes fan fiction as a mode of writing that exists in a space between two opposing ideologies or imperatives. Mimesis on the one hand, and innovation on the other. According to Jenkins, right, the way that he frames it, mimesis refers to the creation of what Jean Baudrillard would call a simulacrum of a fictional world. We are meant to see the fan writer, the fan creator, as a substitute for the author, and the work as a close enough recreation of the original that the original becomes irrelevant for a reading of a fan text. On the other hand, innovation, and specifically subversion. According to Jenkins, all fan fiction is motivated by a desire to introduce new concepts, exploit existing gaps in the fictional world, or even rewrite existing narratives as quote-unquote correctives. These fan creators essentially insert new ideas into their reproduction of the original. Now, the fan film specifically, which is what we'll be talking about today, has become more popular and widespread thanks to streaming technology and sites like YouTube. An attempt to push this paradox of fidelity on the one hand and innovation on the other beyond the written word and into a visual medium, which introduces naturally a whole new array of challenges, right? Now you have to consider actor performances, coded iconography, sound effects, and so on. This isn't to say, as an anecdote, that fan films began with the internet. On the contrary, Jenkins describes small fan communities in the late 80s and early 90s who would create fan videos by splicing together VHS cassette tapes, sometimes adding musical tracks, and then distributing them through the post. These might sometimes include amateur recreations of recognizable scenes. But the shift from print to digital, just as it affected written fan fiction, has had the same kind of impact on the production, distribution, and reception of fan films. And what we're going to do today is take a look at 3 particular fan films that have been uploaded to YouTube and are freely available through this particular lens of how they try to navigate this paradox of creating something that fans would recognize on the one hand, and on the other hand, introducing something new, introducing something you haven't seen before. I want to start with 2 clips from a fan film named Star Wars Revelations, written by Don Coings and Sarah Yarosky, released in 2005. A tiny bit of context about this film before we look at the clips: it was released slightly before Revenge of the Sith, which was the film that concluded the controversial Star Wars prequel trilogy. Revelations purports to tell a story that takes place between the 3rd and 4th films, between the trilogies. And this is the initial chronological gap that Jenkins mentions as a potential source of exploitation, right? That time period was never extensively covered in the films. Therefore, the fan creators are able to position themselves there without openly contradicting existing canonical events. Let's take a look at the first scene. go. Yeah. Okay.
Come with a message from the Emperor.
Senators, honored delegates, you have the distinct honor of assisting me in bringing peace and order to our troubled galaxy. I have given system and sector control to the Moth. Commerce and travel will now be regulated by the Empire for the safety and benefit of its loyal citizens. In your eagerness to comply, I have complete faith that order will reign on your home world. Immediately.
This is preposterous! By what right?
By the right of the Emperor's wishes.
The Emperor thanks you for your continued loyalty to the Empire.
Okay, that's enough for now. So this scene features the antagonist of the fan film, Jana, the woman in red, who is an original creation, you could probably tell, but also has a recreation of the film's iconic villains, right? Darth Vader and the Emperor, who are instantly recognizable, at least in terms of what they are attempting to be. They're drawn from the source material. This scene is significant because it dramatizes something that is mentioned in dialogue in the original Star Wars film in 1977, the dissolution of the Senate, here dramatized and presented visually. And we see in this scene an encapsulation of that opposing set of ideologies. Note how the voice actors for Darth Vader and the Emperor are very much trying to copy the accents and inflections of James Earl Jones and Ian McDiarmid, right? Immediately. Note how some of the extras are dressed in similar fashion to characters that you see in the George Lucas films. You have the little cameo by R2-D2. But at the same time, the presence of Jana in this supposedly significant and meant to be an allusion to canon scene makes this more than just a recreation or a dramatization, right? It's part of her storyline. She is the one who gets the villainous introduction coming down the stairs. Everyone's terrified of her, and not Vader. So the scene is designed to emphasize her villainous nature and not the characters that we already recognize. Let's move on to the second clip.
Paying debts. You owe me your life, yet all you've done is use me.
Your visions of the Jedi Temple's destruction were worthless to me. I'm alive because I laid the charges myself.
Okay. You may be wondering, those of you who have even a passing familiarity with Star Wars, what makes this scene so odd? The spectacle of lightsaber fights is an iconic part of the franchise. It's in every movie. We all know what they look like. We all know what they sound like. This is nothing unusual. And indeed, the creators take great pains to make them sound and look like, quote-unquote, the real thing, right? Down to the sound effects. If you notice, when they move the swords around, they make the same noise. What's different here? To understand that, we have to keep in mind... to keep in mind the attempted subversion here, we have to remember a long-running criticism of the Star Wars films, which is that for many years, they were characterized in part by a lack of roles for women. This is the first film example of a lightsaber duel between two women, and George Lucas did not create it. right? So this is subversion, right? This is resistance. This is an attempt to create a scene that does not appear in any film until recently, which was also not Lucas, but that's a whole other Pandora's box. Now, this fan film ends with Jannah, the antagonist, executed by Darth Vader, and the protagonist flying off to have adventures somewhere far from where the story of Star Wars takes place. It's a cyclical structure, and it is cyclical because it ends with a return to the status quo of the first film, as if to reassure the audience that the simulacrum is not trying to override the canonical events of the film, which everyone already knows. It's not trying to violate the established spatial or temporal setting of the source material. There is a slight catch here, which is that when Revenge of the Sith came out that same year and concluded Lucas's trilogy, it retroactively rendered the events of this film moot by telling its own set of events set in the same time frame. So rather than be considered an untold story, right, something that you don't get to see but might have happened, this becomes an explicitly alternative take on the canonical events of the film franchise, which is the inherent danger in creating fan fiction in a franchise that continues to exist, right? There is still a distinct hierarchy of meaning and of determining what is canon, what is almost canon, and what is not canon at all. Let's move on to another interesting feature that has become more and more commonplace in contemporary fan films. This is a trailer for an episode of a web series called Star Trek New Voyages. This is also online on YouTube. It's a serialized project that purports to continue the ongoing narrative of 1966's Star Trek, the original show, with actors cast in the familiar roles, Captain Kirk, Spock, Dr. McCoy, and so on a film set that recreates the USS Enterprise. The web series homepage actually declares that since Star Trek was canceled after its third season, New Voyages is being presented as the fourth season, the fourth year of their adventures. And this episode was released in 2007. Take a look and see if you notice anything interesting.
An attempt to rescue the Enterprise from a Romulan threat has propelled Sulu forward 30 years in time.
There's a signal. Looks to be Sulu. Well, something's near, right?
Mr. Sulu, what was 30 years to you was 30 seconds to us.
Something else? Alana.
Who is she?
She's my daughter.
You're Captain Kirk, aren't you?
How did you know?
My father told me you were in prison and knew it. You command miracles and you don't even know it.
I'm starting to.
We now have only 32 minutes before our shields collapse.
I don't care who dies. She lives.
Okay. Fans of Star Trek would probably immediately recognize that the actor playing the older Sulu here is in fact George Takei, who originated the role in 1966. In fact, New Voyages distinguishes itself by featuring several actors from the show and by producing episodes written by writers from the original writing staff. And that raises an interesting question, doesn't it? About the assumed nature of fan fiction. Most fan works, like Revelations, presuppose that there is a distinct separation from the source material, partly for legal reasons, right? Fair use hasn't quite caught up to fan films. They're not quite sure what to do about it. And there's a lot of ambiguity as to what kind of project might cross the line into copyright infringement. But what happens when people who are part of the source work participate in fan films? Does Takei's presence here shift our perception of the series away from an amateur simulation and towards some measure of canonicity? It's a topic that's still being debated today, whether there's an active hierarchy of fan works in terms of their distance relative to the original. We will try to resolve that, but not today. Let's move on to our last segment. This is a 2003 fan film called Batman Dead End. expect a twist or two. It starts at 2. Here we go. Okay.
Asylum like some bastard child that you refuse to take responsibility for. That's why you'll never kill me, Bats. You made me, Daddy.
And criminal scum like you made me. You're going back to Arkham.
This is 2003. This film precedes the Aliens vs. Predator movies. It is before Freddy vs. Jason. Today it seems obvious to us that cinematic universes are a thing. But consider what the director is doing here. Dead End does not have a deep story, right? It's not trying to recontextualize Batman, make us see these characters in a different light. It's simply trying to exploit a different kind of gap in the fictional world. A film like this is taking three separate properties, right? Batman, Alien, Predator, all of which are owned by different studios, and putting them in the same fictional space, right, to fight each other. This would require, if this were an actual film, it would require an immense investment of time and money, legal negotiations, and so on. And fan films, by their very nature, are able to bypass all of this. There are entire series that define themselves by incorporating 3, 5, 10 different works into the same space and seeing what happens. We don't have time to look at it today, but I recommend a web series called The Banff Girls Club, in which heroines from Game of Thrones, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Harry Potter, The Walking Dead, and Twilight end up living in the same house on a reality TV show. It's hilarious, but we don't have time. So look at how closely the director is recreating the appearance of these characters, right? You're meant to know from the moment they show up who they are and what they represent. But this is a combination that in 2003 would have seemed impossible to studios, right? Paramount and Warner Brothers would not have sat down and made this agreement. Nowadays, of course, this seems normal almost. You have the iconic scenes, right, with the alien lunging down and grabbing somebody, where? Into the ceiling, wherever. And you have the Predator with that iconic moment from the Arnold Schwarzenegger film, right, with the sniper rifle, except here he's doing it to an alien who's fighting Batman. So it's this combination and this overlapping of intellectual properties that are only possible thanks to YouTube, thanks to a space online that exists outside of direct corporate control, outside of copyright infringement, in which creators are able to do things like these. How are we doing for time? Got some? Don't got some? I'll assume we have some. You all seem to be enjoying it, so I've got one more for you. I'm going to apologize in advance for a little bit of audio dissonance that you're about to have, but I want you guys to see a really clear demonstration of this split, right? The desire to innovate versus the necessity to replicate. This is we're going to do a little side-by-side comparison. On the right, we have the original 1966 Star Trek, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy. This is an episode called Mirror, Mirror. On the left, you have a different Star Trek production. This is called Star Trek Continues because there is competition within online spaces, but there is no monopoly. So this is a different fan series, not New Voyages. And, well, let's see what happens.
For that time, I have something to say. How long before the Hulkin prediction of galactic revolt is realized?
Approximately 240 years.
The inevitable outcome.
The Empire shall be overthrown, of course.
The illogic of waste, Mr. Spock. Waste of lives, potential, resources, time. I submit to you that your empire is illogical. Because it cannot endure. I submit that you are illogical. To be a willing part of it. To be a willing part of it.
1 minute. You have 1 minute and 23 seconds.
If change is inevitable, predictable, beneficial, logic demand that you be a part of it.
One man cannot summon the future.
But one man can change the present.
Let's move a little bit ahead. And this is the moment of divergence.
Kirk, I shall consider it.
Credits are already starting to roll here. This is practically finished. Here is just the beginning of the episode, right? So we have at the very beginning an almost word-for-word recreation of the 1966 series. And then we have a very conscious and very evident split from the canon, right? We are going to tell a different kind of story. As with any fan film, or any work of fan fiction in general, what we see here is a constant negotiation between a past that is set in stone, that has to be replicated in as detailed a fashion as possible, right? You have to have that initial mimesis, and negotiate that with an almost infinite array of possible futures to explore, alternative perspectives, things that you cannot get on network TV. Thank you.